Lonely rancher discovered an injured Apache woman near well. Rancher
It's all
took
right,
her
you're
in.
safe now.
Before we dive into the story, don't forget to subscribe and like the video and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. The New Mexico desert stretched out under the hard glare of late afternoon, a country carved by wind and silence. Daniel McGraw reined in his mare near an abandoned well, its stone ring crumbling, shadows falling long across the dust. He had been riding since morning, checking fence lines that seemed to break faster than he could mend them. That was when he saw her. At first, she looked no more than another bundle of rags discarded by the wind. But as his eyes adjusted, the shape took on the outline of a person, lying motionless beneath the brittle shade of a mesquite tree. Daniel slid from the saddle, hand brushing the worn grip of the colt at his hip. In this country, a man learned caution as naturally as he learned thirst. He approached slowly. It was a woman, tall, broad-shouldered, her skin darkened by the sun. Her leg bent at an angle no leg should take, the leather wrapping torn and stiff with dried blood. Her face was streaked with dust, lips cracked as if they had not touched water in days, and yet her chest rose faintly, steady enough to say she still clung to life. What caught his attention most was her hands. They clutched a small deerskin pouch so tightly that her knuckles blanched against the leather. Whatever it held, she would rather die than let it go. Daniel crouched beside her, his soldier's eyes scanning the ground. No fresh tracks, only the ghost of hoofprints leading west, baked hard into the dirt. Whoever had left her here was long gone. "Ma'am." His voice was low, the kind a man used around horses and the dying. Her eyelids fluttered. Slowly, dark eyes opened, black as obsidian, sharp even through the fever glaze. They fixed on him, then dropped to the revolver at his side. Suspicion, fierce and unspoken, burned between them. Daniel hesitated. Then, with deliberate calm, he unhooked the canteen from his saddle and brought it to her lips. "Here, drink." For a moment she did not move. Then, with effort, she lifted her head enough to take the water. She drank in short, desperate sips, never loosening her grip on the pouch. When she pulled away, her breath trembled, but a sliver of strength returned to her eyes. "You'll not walk on that leg," Daniel muttered. He glanced toward the horizon, empty, merciless. Leaving her here meant leaving her to die. With a grunt, he slid his arms beneath her, lifting her as carefully as his scarred shoulder allowed. She was heavy, solid like sandbagged earth, but her body quivered with exhaustion. He set her on the saddle, bound her broken limb with a length of rope, then swung up behind. The horse shifted under their weight, hooves stirring a thin veil of red dust. "All right," Daniel said, more to himself than to her. "Let's get you out of this heat before it finishes the job." The mare started forward, carrying them away from the empty well, away from the silence that had nearly claimed her. Ahead, on the ridge, the outline of his weather-beaten cabin waited, a lone mark of man against the vast desert. The cabin door groaned as Daniel pushed it open with his boot. The hinges had not seen oil in months. Inside, the air carried the faint scent of wood smoke and old pine, the sort of smell that clung to a man's clothes when he lived too long alone. He eased the woman down onto the narrow bed in the corner, the same bed where his wife once slept before the cholera fever stole her breath 10 years ago. For a moment his chest tightened, old grief cutting fresh. He shook it off, pulling a folded blanket from the chair and covering her with it. Her eyes opened again, sharp and guarded. The leather pouch was still pressed tight against her chest. When Daniel reached to adjust the blanket, she tensed, knuckles whitening. "Easy," he said softly, hands lifted in surrender. "I'm not here to take it." She said nothing, only watched him with that deep, burning suspicion, as though he were one more wolf in a desert already full of them. Daniel knew the look well. He had seen it on soldiers in the last days of war, the eyes of those who had lost too much to trust anything offered freely. He rummaged through a small wooden chest, pulling out strips of clean cloth, a bottle of strong liquor, and a pocket knife. Setting them beside the bed, he crouched. "Your leg needs splinting, or it'll heal wrong. That's no way to live out here." Her jaw tightened, but after a long silence, she gave a faint nod. Daniel cut away the torn leather of her legging, poured the liquor across the wound. She gritted her teeth, sweat beading along her brow, yet she made no sound, not a curse, not a cry. Daniel muttered under his breath, "Stubborn as a mule." He placed 2 wooden slats on either side of her leg, bound them firm with rope. When it was done, he set a canteen beside her pillow. "Drink when you can. Blanket'll keep the night chill off." She shifted only enough to prop herself against the wall, one hand still gripping the pouch. Her eyes never left him, following each movement like a hawk keeping measure of an enemy. Daniel pulled off his boots, dragged an old bench to the porch, and settled there. The revolver rested on his thigh, a habit too ingrained to break. Outside, the desert wind howled low and steady, carrying with it the dry scent of sage and dust. Through the crack in the door, he saw the fire's glow painting her shadow long across the wall. She wasn't asleep. She wouldn't be. Every snap of wood in the stove jolted her eyes open, hand tightening on that pouch. Daniel leaned back, staring up at the wheeling stars. He thought of the cross nailed above the cabin's hearth, the one he carved himself from cedar the year his wife died. It was his only anchor on nights like this, when the loneliness pressed too close. His lips moved in a whisper, barely more than a breath. "God sets the lonely in families," Psalm 68:6. The words settled in the air like a promise, though he had no idea yet if God truly intended to keep it. Inside, the woman sat await against the wall, guarding her secret. Outside, Daniel kept watch against the night. And between them, in the silence of that desert cabin, something fragile had begun to take root. Not trust, not yet, but the first thread of a bond neither had asked for. To continue this adventure, please subscribe to our channel. It helps us keep creating. Morning came slow, bleeding through the cracks of the shuttered cabin. Daniel stirred the ashes in the stove, coaxing a thin flame to life. He dropped in a handful of cornmeal and stirred until the pale porridge bubbled. The smell filled the single-room cabin, modest but steady, like most things in his life since the war. On the bed, the Apache woman was awake. Her dark eyes followed his movements, sharp as a blade. She said nothing, though her hand was still tight around that leather pouch. "Not much," Daniel muttered, setting the bowl near her, "but it'll keep you standing." For a long moment she didn't move. Finally, with effort, she pushed herself up, accepted the bowl, and ate. Slowly, carefully, as if testing both the food and the man who made it. Daniel sat at the table, silent, pretending to busy himself with mending a bit of tack. He didn't press her with questions. Years alone had taught him patience. When she finished, she set the empty bowl aside and pressed her palms to the bed. Daniel frowned as she tried to rise. "Hold on, your leg's still busted." She shook her head, gestured toward his tool rack by the door. He realized she meant for a cane. Reluctantly, he fetched one, cut from an old mesquite branch. She took it, leaned hard, and pushed herself to her feet. Sweat gathered at her temples, but her jaw stayed tight. Daniel followed her out to the porch. The morning air was cool, carrying the faint scent of sagebrush. She limped toward the corral where his horse stood tethered. He thought she meant only to look, but she went straight to the trough, scooped water in her hands, and offered it to the animal. The mare, usually skittish, accepted calmly. "You ought to be resting," Daniel said. She ignored him, moved on to gather a bundle of straw stacked near the barn. It was clumsy with her injured leg, but she managed, dragging the bundle across the yard. Daniel almost stepped in to stop her, but something in the set of her shoulders held him back. Finally, she pointed with the cane toward the broken section of fence, wire sagging between leaning posts. Daniel sighed. "That old fence has been waiting on me for weeks." By midday, they worked side by side, an unlikely pair against the endless horizon. Daniel hammered posts into the ground while she steadied the lyre. Her hands were strong, steady, despite the strain of her leg. He watched her for a moment, sweat streaking her brow, hair sticking to her cheek, but not a word of complaint left her lips. When the last wire was fastened, Daniel dropped to the ground with a grunt, leaning against the post. She brought him the canteen, held it out firmly. "Drink," she said. Her voice was hoarse but steady. Daniel took it, surprised at the command in her tone. He drank deep, then looked at her, meeting her eyes for the first time without the shield of suspicion between them. "Thank you," he said quietly. She gave no answer, but for the first time her gaze did not feel like a blade. The wind picked up across the desert, rattling the dry grass along the ridge. Daniel felt a strange stirring in his chest. Not trust, not yet, but the faint recognition of another soul willing to fight just as hard as he had to survive. The sun climbed higher, washing the yard in pale heat. Daniel leaned against the porch rail, arms crossed, watching as the woman moved about the corral. She hobbled carefully with the cane, but her hands were steady as she brushed down his mare, working the dust out of the animal's coat. The horse, usually wary of strangers, stood calm beneath her touch, snorting softly. Daniel couldn't help the flicker of surprise. A horse told you more about a person than words ever could. This woman, Apache or not, carried a presence the animal respected. She finished the brushing, then stooped to gather a few flakes of hay from the barn. Daniel caught himself staring. Not at her beauty, though she had a fierce kind of grace, but at the stubborn will that burned in her. Most folk with a leg splinted that way would be begging for rest. She refused to bend. When she caught him watching, her eyes narrowed, and she turned away. Daniel pushed off the rail and went inside, shaking his head. He busied himself in the storage shed, searching for a coil of rope. His hand brushed against a small bundle tucked in the corner. He froze. It was a handkerchief, edges frayed, the faded blue barely visible now. His throat tightened. He lifted it carefully, as if it were made of glass. The cloth smelled faintly of lavender, his wife's scent, though years had passed since the fever took her. He didn't hear Ioka step in until she bent down, picked it up after he dropped it. Dust clung to the fabric. She brushed it gently, then held it out toward him. "I was just trying to," she began. "Put it down," Daniel snapped, sharper than he meant. His voice filled the cramped shed like thunder. Her eyes widened slightly, but she did as told, laying the handkerchief on the workbench with deliberate care. She stood still, cane pressed firm against the dirt, her gaze unreadable. Daniel snatched the cloth, folded it with rough hands, and tucked it back into the corner. His jaw worked as he struggled for breath, anger and grief knotted tight in his chest. "Don't touch it," he muttered, more to himself than to her. For a long moment, the shed was heavy with silence. Dust motes floated in the shaft of light that cut through the roof boards. Finally, Ioka turned and limped back into the yard without a word. Daniel leaned against the wall, head bowed. His fists clenched around the handkerchief, wrinkling the delicate fabric. The image of his wife's face, her soft laugh, the way she braided her hair by the hearth, rose sharp and painful. He pressed the cloth to his forehead, eyes closed, as if holding it could somehow bridge the gap between past and present. When he finally emerged, the afternoon sun was sliding toward the horizon. Ioka was sitting by the trough, the mare's reins looped loosely around her wrist. She didn't look at him when he passed. That night, the cabin held no words. Daniel lit the stove, stirred beans in a pot, set a plate in front of her. She ate quietly, gaze on the fire. Every so often her eyes flicked toward him, as if measuring the storm still brewing inside. Daniel sat back, staring into the flames, the folded handkerchief heavy in his pocket. The silence stretched like wire between them, taut and unyielding. The desert night wrapped itself around the cabin, sharp with the scent of dry grass and cold air that slipped through the cracks. The fire in the stove crackled low, throwing restless shadows across the wooden walls. Daniel lay on the bench, one arm folded beneath his head, the other resting on the colt at his side. Sleep wouldn't come. He kept his eyes half closed, watching the woman across the room. Ioka hadn't touched the bed. Instead, she sat against the wall, knees drawn, that leather pouch clutched tight against her chest. Every gust of wind outside made her flinch, eyes darting to the door as if expecting it to burst open. Hours passed like that. Silence, broken only by the fire and the groan of the cabin in the wind. Then, at last, she moved. Her hands worked the thong of the pouch, slow, deliberate, as though untying it were both a risk and a prayer. Daniel's breath caught in his throat. The flap opened, and something silver gleamed in the firelight. A faint metallic clink filled the room as she lifted it free. It was a totem, carved in the shape of a wolf, muzzle lifted toward the moon. The silver surface was worn, but the detail still sharp. Beneath it lay a piece of leather, charred along the edges as if it had survived fire. A map, though the markings were faint. Ioka held the totem carefully, almost reverently, and pressed it against her forehead. Her lips moved in words Daniel could not hear, a ritual older than his world. Finally, she looked up. Her eyes met his across the glow of the fire. The suspicion was still there, but softened, mixed with something heavier, grief, perhaps, or desperation. "This," she said, her voice low and raspy, "is proof." Daniel sat up, leaning forward. "Proof of what?" "They say my father betrayed the tribe, that he gave away secrets to the enemy. They will put him to death when the moon is full." Her hands tightened around the totem. "But this proves his innocence. The ones who framed him, they fear it. If I die, the truth dies with me." The words hung heavy in the air. Daniel rubbed his face, staring into the fire. He knew the weight of accusation, the cruelty of lies. War had been full of them, men condemned not for what they did, but for what others needed them to be. Ioka's eyes burned, defiant, though her voice trembled. "I cannot let him die in shame." Daniel leaned back, exhaling. His hand brushed the wooden cross carved into the wall above the stove. Quietly, the verse returned to him. "He heals the broken-hearted and binds up their wounds." Psalm 147:3. He looked at her again, at the stubborn fire that kept her alive even with a broken leg and half a desert against her. "You're not going anywhere," he said at last. His voice was steady, firm. "Not until you're strong enough to stand. I won't let you die out here over that pouch." For a moment she blinked, startled, not in fear, but in disbelief. Then she lowered the totem back into the pouch, tied it shut, and pulled the blanket around her shoulders. For the first time since he found her, her hand did not grip the pouch as if it were her last breath. Morning light spilled across the cabin floor, streaking gold through the narrow gaps in the shutters. Daniel rose early, as habit dictated, and set about feeding the fire. When he turned, he found Ioka already awake, sitting on the edge of the bed with the pouch beside her. Her dark hair fell loose around her shoulders, her face still pale from the wound, but her eyes no longer looked wild. She gestured toward the door with her cane. "You should be resting," Daniel said, but she only shook her head. They went outside together. The air was crisp, the sun low over the horizon, painting the desert in soft reds. Daniel carried tools to mend another stretch of fence while Ioka followed, steadying herself with each step. At first, he worked in silence, hammering posts into the dry earth. But after a while, her voice rose behind him, quiet, almost lost to the wind. "They cast me out," she said. Daniel paused, set down the hammer. "My father was accused of treachery. They said he gave away the hunting grounds, that he led enemies to our people. I stood by him. I told them it was not true. But when I refused to condemn him, they turned on me as well. To them, loyalty was guilt." Her eyes were fixed on the horizon, but her voice carried the weight of memory. I walked away from the fire circle that night with nothing but this pouch. My mother's tears followed me, but no hand reached out to stop me. The hammer felt heavy in Daniel's grip. He remembered another firelight, long ago, campfires on battlefields, men judged not by truth but by necessity. He remembered comrades executed for desertion when all they wanted was to go home. He remembered the fever that took his wife on the trail west, and how the townsfolk turned their faces away when he asked for help. Exile had many forms. "You think you're the only one left?" Daniel said finally. His voice was rough, not from anger, but from the rawness of truth. "But there are plenty of us carrying ghosts." Ayoka's gaze shifted to him. For the first time, it held something other than suspicion. Recognition, perhaps. The kind of look one soul gives another when it realizes it is not alone in its wounds. She limped closer, steadied herself against the half-mended fence. Together they stretched the wire, her fingers working in rhythm with his hammer. For a moment, their movements fit like two pieces of a broken tool made whole again. When the work was done, Daniel wiped the sweat from his brow. Ayoka reached into the pouch at her side, drew out a strip of dried meat, and held it toward him. "Eat," she said simply. He took it, chewing slowly. They sat in the dust, sharing food without words. Above them, the sky widened, endless and blue. Daniel glanced at her again, at the strength wrapped in silence, at the stubbornness that kept her moving even on a broken leg. For the first time since the war, he felt the faintest stirrings of something that was not grief, not anger. It was connection. Fragile, yes, but real. The sky turned a dull copper as the wind rose, sweeping dust across the ridge. Daniel was stacking lumber near the shed when he heard the sound, hooves pounding steady, drawing closer. His hand went instinctively to the colt at his side. A single rider crested the hill. Tall, lean, his horse black as coal. The man's face was streaked with red paint, his eyes sharp and unblinking. He reined in hard at the edge of the yard, the horse pawing the ground with impatience. "I am looking for someone," the warrior called, his voice rough as gravel. Daniel stepped forward, keeping his stance calm but firm. "Who?" "A woman," the rider said. His gaze swept the cabin, the corral, then fixed on Daniel. "Her name is Ayoka. She stole the tribe's totem and fled. If it is not returned, blood will be spilled." Daniel felt the weight of those words settle like a stone in his chest. Behind him, the cabin door creaked. Ayoka stood in the threshold, cane braced against the floor, her face pale, but her eyes hard as flint. "I did not steal it," she said, her voice steady though her breath came shallow. "The totem was taken by liars to frame my father. I only took back what was ours." The warrior's lip curled in contempt. "That is what every traitor says. Your father has already been condemned. To bring it back now will not save him. It will only brand your family with more shame." The wind rattled the boards of the fence they had repaired that morning. Daniel saw Ayoka's jaw tighten, saw for the first time the flicker of fear beneath her defiance. He stepped forward, closing the distance between himself and the warrior. "She stays here." The man's eyes narrowed. "You would stand against her own people?" "I'll stand against anyone who means her harm," Daniel said. His hand rested casually on the grip of his Colt, not drawing, but ready. "She's not going anywhere until she's healed. That's final." For a moment, silence stretched. The horse shifted, blowing through its nostrils. The warrior's stare burned into Daniel, weighing his resolve. At last he gave a sharp tug on the reins. "So be it. I will bring word to the council. When judgment comes, it will fall on both your heads." He turned the horse with a jerk, and in moments the rider was a dark silhouette against the storm-blown horizon, then gone. Daniel stood still, the echo of hooves fading into the distance. Behind him, Ioka's grip on the cane faltered. She leaned against the doorframe, her eyes on him. Not sharp, not suspicious, but searching. "You should not have done that," she whispered. Daniel looked at her squarely. "I don't regret it." The wind howled around the cabin, rattling the loose shutters. Inside, the fire crackled, the shadows stretching long across the walls. But for the first time, the silence between them was not born of distrust. It was born of something heavier, something heavy. Night settled heavy over the desert. The storm had passed, leaving the air sharp and clean. Inside the cabin, the stove glowed, filling the room with a restless orange light. Daniel sat at the table, turning the folded handkerchief slowly in his calloused hands. Across the room, Ioka sat on the edge of the bed, her pouch beside her, her cane propped against the wall. For a long time, neither spoke. The fire popped and sighed, as though carrying the weight of the silence for them. Finally, Daniel's voice broke through, low, uneven. "That handkerchief belonged to my wife." Ioka's eyes lifted. "She died on the trail 10 years ago. Cholera took her fast. By the time I buried her, I was the only one left. Folks around here call me a rancher, but truth is, I'm just a man who stayed because I had nowhere else to go." He looked down at the cloth, thumb running over its faded edge. "I kept it because it's all that remains of her." The words hung in the air like smoke. Daniel felt exposed, raw in a way the war had never left him. For a long while, Ioka said nothing. Then she shifted, pulling aside the fabric at her shoulder. In the firelight, a scar gleamed pale against her skin, running deep across the muscle. "They gave me this when I was cast out," she said, her voice low but steady. "My father was accused of betrayal. I would not speak against him, so they marked me, told me I had no place among them. Since that night, I have carried only this scar and the totem." Her hand brushed the pouch. The fire crackled. Outside, the wind pressed faintly against the walls. Daniel rose from his chair, crossing the room slowly, as though any sudden movement might break the fragile thread that bound them. He sat on the bench near the bed, close enough to see the fatigue in her eyes, the strength etched deep into her face. "Seems we've both been carrying graves," he murmured. Ioka met his gaze. Her eyes no longer burned with suspicion, nor even with defiance. Instead, they held something quieter: tiredness, recognition, a fragile trust. For a long moment, neither moved. Then Daniel lifted his hand, slow, deliberate, and touched the scar at her shoulder. She did not flinch. The distance between them shrank, not in a rush, but in the slow inevitability of two lives pulled together by loss. Their first kiss came softly, as if testing whether it was real, as if both had waited too long to risk breaking it. When they parted, Ioka's breath lingered against his cheek. She pulled the blanket around her shoulders, but her hand no longer clutched the pouch like a lifeline. Daniel stood, tossing another log into the stove. The fire caught quick, sparks spiraling upward. "Tomorrow," he said quietly, "we finish the fence. I'll need your help." She gave a faint nod, a rare softness touching her lips. That night, for the first time since she arrived, she slept deeply. And Daniel, lying on the bench within the circle of firelight, no longer saw the cabin as a place of solitude. It was becoming a home. The journey to explore the Wild West is still long. Subscribe to hear more true stories. If you're still watching, drop a 1 in the comments. Dawn broke pale and sharp across the desert, light spilling over the ridge like a blade of silver. Daniel stood at the cabin door, watching the horizon. He had not slept much. None of them had, not since Red Hawk's visit. The threat of judgment hung heavy, an unspoken weight that pressed on the air itself. Behind him, Ioka stirred. She leaned on her cane, her legs still bound in splints, but her eyes were steady. The leather pouch rested against her side, tied close with rawhide. "It is time," she said simply. Daniel turned, brow furrowed. "You can't ride far yet. That leg!" Her jaw tightened. "If we wait, my father dies at the full moon. We have little more than 3 nights. The elders will not listen after that." There it was, the point of no return. Daniel knew the truth of her words. Whatever life they had carved these last days, fragile and warm, would end if they stayed behind. He nodded slowly. "Then we ride." The rest of the morning was spent in silence, broken only by the sounds of preparation. Daniel strapped his Winchester across the saddle, checked the cylinder of his Colt, and filled the canteens from the well. Dried beans and jerky went into a sack, rope, blankets, and a flint for fire. Ioka helped as best she could, moving stiffly but with purpose, never once setting aside the pouch. When all was ready, Daniel paused inside the cabin. The fire had died down to faint embers. On the wall above the stove hung the cedar cross he had carved years ago. He removed his hat, bowed his head. "Lord," he whispered, voice low but firm, "you've led me through battlefields and empty nights. Lead us now. Keep her safe. Keep me steady. And if we fall, let it be with honor in your sight." The words settled into the silence, a prayer half plea, half both. Ioka stepped into the doorway, watching. Her face was unreadable, but for a moment her gaze softened, as though she had glimpsed a part of him he had never shown another soul. "Your God gives you strength," she said quietly. Daniel looked up, meeting her eyes. Sometimes all a man's got left is faith. Outside, the mare stamped impatiently, sensing the journey ahead. Daniel swung the provisions onto the saddle, then helped Ioka mount, careful with her wounded leg. He climbed up behind, reins in hand. The sun was climbing higher now, heat already pressing down across the land. Ahead lay miles of desert, mountains sharp against the horizon. Somewhere beyond, a circle of fire where judgment would fall. Daniel set his jaw, guiding the mare forward. Dust rose behind them, trailing like a thin banner in the wind. There was no turning back. The trail wound upward into the mountains, a narrow path carved between sheer cliffs and jagged stone. The mare climbed steadily, hooves clattering against loose rock. Dust rose with each step, hanging in the thin, dry air. Daniel held the reins firm, his body leaning with the horse's movement. Behind him, Ioka swayed but did not complain. Her arm rested lightly against his side, not for comfort but for balance. The leather pouch was secured at her waist, its weight a reminder of why they rode. Hours passed. The sun rose high, burning against the stone walls. Sweat trickled down Daniel's neck. He remembered campaigns across deserts long ago, where men dropped one by one under the heat, their canteens long empty. That memory gnawed at him now, but he pushed it aside. "You holding on?" he asked over his shoulder. Ioka's voice was steady. "I will not fall." Her words carried no arrogance, only determination. He believed her. By midday, they paused at a stream cutting through the rocks. Daniel dismounted, helping her down carefully. She crouched by the water, splashing it across her face, drinking in slow sips. For a moment, the hardness in her eyes softened. Daniel knelt nearby, filling the canteens. His shoulder ached from old scars, but he said nothing. Watching her kneel by the water, hair falling across her face, he thought again how strange this was. An Apache woman and a worn-out rancher, 2 lives never meant to cross, bound together by truth and necessity. When they set off again, the trail grew steeper. Loose stones rattled down the slopes with each step. Hawks circled high above, their cries echoing against the cliffs. Ioka gripped the saddle horn, her leg trembling with the strain, but she did not ask to stop. Daniel glanced at her, admiration flickering in his chest. "You're tougher than most men I rode with in the war." She turned her head, eyes sharp, but there was the faintest ghost of a smile at the corner of her mouth. By late afternoon, they reached a plateau overlooking the valley. The land stretched wide and endless, rolling hills, dark ridges, and far beyond, the faint curl of smoke rising from the direction of the tribal council grounds. Ayoka's gaze locked on that smoke. Her fingers pressed against the pouch. 3 nights, she murmured. We must reach them before the moon is full. Daniel followed her gaze. The distance seemed impossible, yet he felt the weight of her resolve like steel beside him. 2 cultures, 2 histories, scarred by loss, scarred by mistrust, riding side by side into the same horizon. He took a deep breath, tightened the reins, and guided the mare forward. The mountains swallowed them again, the trail bending into shadow. Night was coming, and with it, danger. The canyon narrowed as dusk approached, the walls closing in on either side. Daniel felt the horse tense beneath him, ears flicking at sounds he could not yet hear. He slowed their pace, eyes scanning the rocks. That was when the first shot rang out. The bullet struck stone just inches from his head, shards scattering across the trail. The mare reared, snorting, nearly unseating them both. Daniel yanked the reins hard, pulling them behind a jut of boulder. Voices echoed from the cliffs, harsh, demanding. "Hand over the pouch, rancher! Do it now and walk away alive!" Daniel's jaw tightened. He drew his Colt, checking the chamber. "Bandits," he muttered. "They must have been tracking us." Another shout. "We know what she carries! Give it up!" The leather pouch pressed against Ayoka's side. She clutched it tighter, eyes flashing. "They cannot have it!" she hissed. Daniel peeked from behind the rock. 4 men, faces masked with rags, rifles glinting in the fading light. They spread across the slope, boxing them in. "Stay low," Daniel ordered. Then he moved. His Colt barked once, twice. Dust and gunpowder filled the air. 1 bandit dropped, rolling down the rocks. The others fired back, bullets sparking against the boulder. The mare screamed, rearing in panic. Daniel's shoulder jerked back, hot pain tearing through flesh. He gritted his teeth, nearly dropping the pistol. Blood seeped down his shirt, warm and fast. Ayoka's heart pounded. She saw him stagger, saw the bandits advancing. Without thinking, she reached for the Winchester tied to the saddle. Her hands were steady, though her leg trembled. She braced herself against the rock, lifted the rifle, and pulled the trigger. The crack of the shot echoed like thunder. 1 of the bandits spun and fell. The others faltered, surprised to see a woman standing tall, cane at her side, rifle leveled with unshaking hands. "Go!" she shouted, her voice raw but commanding. "Leave now, or join them in the dirt!" The 2 remaining men exchanged a glance. They had seen enough. Dragging their wounded comrade, they scrambled back up the slope, vanishing into the rocks. Silence rushed in, broken only by the ringing in Daniel's ears and the rasp of his own breath. He leaned against the boulder, clutching his shoulder, his Colt slipping from his grip. "Well," he muttered, voice weak, "remind me never to doubt you with a rifle." Ayoka dropped to her knees beside him, hands already tearing cloth from her dress. "You are bleeding too fast," she said, her voice shaking, though her fingers worked with calm precision. "Stay awake." Daniel tried to smile, though his face was pale. "Still breathing, not dead yet." The rifle leaned against the rock, smoke curling faintly from the barrel. The pouch still hung at her waist, untouched. For the first time since leaving the cabin, Ayoka allowed herself a long breath. She had protected both the totem and the man beside her. But the journey was far from over. They made camp in a hollow between 2 ridges, a place half sheltered from the night wind. The mare stood nearby, reins tied to a scrub cedar, sides heaving from the long climb. Daniel sat with his back against the stone, his shirt darkened by blood. Every movement brought a grimace, but he bit it back, unwilling to show weakness. Ayoka knelt beside him, laying out what few supplies they had: strips of cloth, a flask of water, the small knife he had carried since the war. Her hands moved steady, but her breath came sharp and quick, as though each drop of blood she wiped away was her own. "You should rest," Daniel muttered. She shot him a look. "If you stop talking, perhaps I will." With a firm tug, she pressed cloth against the wound. Daniel hissed, jaw tightening. She bound the strip tight, leaning close as she tied the knot. The scent of smoke and sage clung to her hair. For a long moment, neither spoke. Only the fire cracked, throwing orange light across the canyon walls. Finally, Daniel broke the silence. "You didn't have to pick up that rifle." Her dark eyes lifted to his. "Yes, I did. If you fell, everything would be lost. The totem, the truth, my father." She paused, voice softer now. "You." Daniel swallowed, caught off guard by the word. He reached for the pouch resting at her side, not to take it, but to touch it lightly with his fingertips. "All this time, you've carried the truth like a burden, heavy enough to break anyone." Her gaze faltered, but she did not pull away. "Truth is all I have left." Daniel leaned back, his eyes on the fire. "Scripture says you will know the truth, and the truth will set you free. Maybe freedom doesn't come easy. Maybe you have to fight for it, bleed for it." She studied him, something shifting in her expression. The hard suspicion that once guarded her eyes was gone. What replaced it was gentler, vulnerable, but no less strong. Slowly, she reached out, her hand resting over his on the pouch. "Then let us carry it together." The firelight flickered between them, their shadows stretching long against the rock. Daniel turned his hand, clasping hers. Calloused palm against scarred fingers. Pain still throbbed in his shoulder, sharp and unforgiving, but for the first time since the ambush, he felt steady. Not because the wound was bound, but because of the woman beside him. Her strength, her resolve, her trust given at last. He managed a faint smile. "Guess I'll be leaning on you tomorrow." Her lips curved, the faintest ghost of a smile in return. "Then you'd better keep walking, rancher. We have a long road still." The night closed in, cold and vast. But between them, the fire burned steady, a quiet testimony that neither carried the weight alone anymore. By the third evening, the valley opened wide before them, filled with the glow of firelight. Smoke curled upward, carrying the scent of pine and sage. Figures gathered in a great circle, their faces lit red by the flames. The tribal council had assembled. Daniel reined in the mare at the edge of the clearing. His shoulder throbbed with each movement, but he forced his body upright. Ayoka slid down carefully, leaning on her cane, her pouch pressed close against her side. Every eye turned toward them as they entered the circle. Warriors stood silent, women whispered behind covered mouths, children peered from the shadows. One of the elders, his hair white as bone, lifted a hand. "Why have you come, Ayoka, daughter of Taza? You were cast out. You carry no voice here." Ayoka drew a breath, steady despite the weight of the moment. She stepped forward, leaning hard on her cane, but refusing to falter. "I come not for myself," she said, her voice carrying clear into the night, "but for my father. You condemned him for treachery, but he is no traitor. He was betrayed." Murmurs rippled through the circle. From the far side, Red Hawk pushed forward, his face painted, his eyes flashing.
"Lies," he spat. "She clings to shame. Her father traded our secrets for his own gain. She steals back what does not belong to her and brings it to this place like a thief in the dark." Ayoka's jaw tightened. She untied the pouch, drew out the silver totem, and lifted it high. Firelight glinted off the wolf's form, its muzzle lifted to the stars. Gasps rose from the crowd. "This totem was stolen from my father to frame him. I found it hidden among those who sought to destroy him. Here is the proof of his honor." The elder leaned forward, eyes narrowing. Red Hawk snarled, his voice rising. "You bring trinkets and claim them as truth. Do not listen. She was cast out for her disobedience. Her word is dust." Ayoka's gaze swept the circle. Her voice rang out, steady and fierce. "You may cast me out, but you cannot silence the truth. My father's life should not be taken for another man's ambition." For a long moment, silence held the fire circle. The elders whispered among themselves, their faces solemn. Daniel stood at Ayoka's side, his hand resting on the butt of his Colt, not in threat, but as a silent pledge that he would stand with her to the last. Finally, the elder spoke, his voice heavy with age. "The totem is no trinket. It carries the spirit of our people. If it was stolen to condemn Taza, then justice has been twisted. We will weigh this carefully." The flames snapped and roared higher, casting long shadows across the council. Daniel looked at Ayoka. Her hand trembled where she held the totem, but her eyes were clear. For the first time, she was no longer just fighting to be heard. She was being heard. The council fire burned deep into the night, shadows of the elders bending long across the circle. Silence pressed down heavy, broken only by the hiss of pine resin in the flames. At last, the eldest among them rose. His face was lined with years, his eyes sharp as obsidian. He lifted the totem high so all could see. The silver wolf shimmered in the firelight, its muzzle forever raised to the stars. "This is no forgery," he declared. "This is the totem of Taza's line. Its absence was the wound by which he was condemned. Its return is proof that his enemies lied." A collective murmur rippled through the gathered crowd. Some heads bowed in shame, others turned toward Red Hawk, whose mouth twisted in fury. "No!" Red Hawk shouted. He stepped forward, fists clenched. "She is a liar! Her father is guilty, and she is nothing but a traitor's child." Daniel's hand rested on the butt of his Colt. His eyes locked on Red Hawk, steady, unflinching. But it was Ayoka who answered. She stepped forward, her cane striking the earth like a drumbeat. "You can call me outcast, call me broken, but you will not call me liar. My father's honor is here, in my hands. If you will not see it, then your eyes are blinded by hate." Gasps rippled through the circle. The elder lifted a hand, silencing the shouts. His voice rang clear over the fire. "Taza will live. His name will be restored. The lies that condemned him are ashes now." The crowd shifted, voices rising in agreement. Some stepped forward to touch the ground before Ayoka, a sign of respect long denied her. The elder's gaze turned to Daniel. And this man, who stood with her against enemies of blood and strangers alike, he is no enemy of the Apache. From this day, he is counted a friend. For a moment, Daniel stood still, the words washing over him. A friend of the Apache. After years of solitude, years of loss, here was a name worth bearing. Red Hawk's fury flared, but no one rose to follow him. His protests were swallowed by the fire's roar and the will of the council. Ioka lowered her head, clutching the totem to her chest. Relief broke across her face, quiet but fierce. For the first time since Daniel had found her by the dry well, her body no longer trembled with fear or defiance. It trembled with release. She turned to Daniel, her voice barely more than a whisper. "It is done." Daniel reached for her hand, calloused fingers closing gently around hers. "No," he said softly, "it's only just begun." The fire crackled, sparks spiraling into the night sky.
Around them, the council dispersed, voices carrying the news into the valley. Taza spared, honor restored, truth victorious. Daniel and Ioka stood side by side, not strangers anymore, but bound by a trial survived together. The wolf totem gleamed between them, no longer a burden carried alone, but a symbol of trust, love, and a future forged in fire. If you like this video, please comment number 9. If you don't like it, please comment number 0. And please leave a comment and share your feelings. Morning mist lay heavy over the valley as Daniel and Ioka rode away from the council grounds. The world felt quieter now, the weight of judgment lifted. Smoke from the great fire thinned behind them, fading into the blue of the sky. Daniel's shoulder ached with every step of the mare, but he said nothing. The wound was real, but the burden he carried felt lighter than it had in years. Beside him, Ioka walked with her cane, her gait uneven yet steady. She no longer clutched the pouch to her chest. It now hung at her belt, swaying lightly as though it had become part of her, no longer a prison, but a truth set free. Neither spoke for a long time. The trail stretched before them, winding between hills brushed gold by the rising sun. The silence between them was not heavy now. It was companionable, like the hush of dawn before a day's work begins. Finally, Daniel broke the quiet. "I didn't reckon I'd live to see a day like that, them calling me friend." Ioka glanced at him, her expression unreadable. "You chose to stand when others would have walked away. That is not forgotten." Daniel smiled faintly. "Guess that makes 2 of us." They pressed on, the day warming. By mid-afternoon, the weathered outline of Daniel's cabin appeared on the hill. The sight brought a strange tightness to his chest. Once, that cabin had been nothing more than a shelter against the wind, a place to endure long nights alone. Now, returning felt different, like coming home. He dismounted slowly, wincing as his shoulder pulled. Ioka hobbled forward, her eyes tracing the old wood, the sagging fence, the corral where horses grazed lazily. She did not turn away. Instead, she set her cane aside and began lifting fallen boards from the yard. Daniel chuckled softly, shaking his head. "You'd think, after what we just came through, you'd want a rest." Her dark eyes flashed with quiet resolve. Home does not build itself. He stood for a moment, watching her work despite her limp, the sunlight catching in her hair. Something in his chest eased. For the first time since the war, since burying his wife, the cabin didn't feel like a monument to loss. It felt alive. They spent the next days in rhythm, a partnership born not of convenience but of choice. Daniel drove new fence posts into the earth, muscles straining though his shoulder protested. Ioka steadied the wire, her hands strong, unshaken. Together they mended the corral, hauled water, split wood. Each evening, as the sun dipped low, they sat side by side on the porch steps. No words were needed. The land stretched wide before them, the horizon painted gold and crimson. They drank from the same canteen, passing it back and forth like kin. One night, Daniel hung his Winchester on the wall inside the cabin. He did it without ceremony, but the act felt like closing a door on the years of waiting for violence to return. Ioka watched him, her gaze soft, and for the first time she let her hair fall loose, dark strands spilling over her shoulders in the firelight. She spoke quietly, almost as though to herself. "I used to believe I had nowhere to return, that I was cast out forever." She paused, eyes flickering toward him. "But this place, it no longer feels like a stranger's shelter." Daniel reached out, his calloused hand resting gently over hers. "If you choose to stay, we'll start over. Together." Her lips curved in the faintest smile, rare but real. She nodded once. The fire in the stove crackled warmly, and outside the wind swept across the grasslands. The cabin no longer stood as a lonely outpost. It pulsed with the rhythm of new life, new trust, and the beginning of something neither had dared hope for. Spring came slowly to the high desert. At first, only the faintest green touched the grasses, a shy promise after long months of dust. But by mid-season, the land awakened. The fields stretched wide with color, wildflowers pushing through dry earth, the air carrying the hum of new life. Around the cabin, change took root as well. Daniel built a small garden, rows of corn sprouting under his hand. Ioka tended them daily, her limp lighter now, her cane less a crutch than a companion. Together they patched the roof, stacked firewood, and mended the corral until it stood strong again. The work was steady, sometimes hard, but never lonely. Where once silence had pressed against the walls, now the cabin carried the sound of footsteps, the scrape of tools, even laughter now and again when Daniel's stubbornness met Ioka's sharp tongue. One evening, as the sun set low and golden across the hills, Daniel stood on the porch with his arms folded, gaze fixed on the horizon. Ioka stepped out beside him, leaning lightly against his shoulder. The warmth of her presence settled him in a way no words could. "We managed to keep what mattered most," he said softly. She looked at him, her dark eyes reflecting the last light of day. Freedom and a home. The silence between them was rich, filled not with what had been lost, but with what had been found. Later that night, as firelight flickered in the stove, Daniel reached for the small cedar cross still hanging on the cabin wall. His fingers brushed the wood, worn smooth by years. Turning to Ioka, he spoke low, his voice steady. "Scripture says, 'The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside still waters. He restores my soul.'" Psalm 23, 1-3. I reckon that's what this is, the Lord leading us to still waters after all the storms. Ioka listened quietly, her hand resting over the pouch that once chained her so tightly. Now it hung forgotten at her side, not as a burden, but as part of a story made whole. She nodded slowly, not with the certainty of creed, but with the quiet recognition that something greater had guided them here. The days slipped into rhythm. In the mornings, Daniel worked the fences while Ioka led the horses to water. In the afternoons, they planted together, pausing often to share a glance, a word, or the kind of silence that spoke deeper than speech. Each night they ended side by side on the porch steps, watching the sky scatter with stars. The cabin was no longer just shelter. It was a heartbeat, a promise, a place where sorrow was not erased, but transformed. One golden evening, Daniel turned to her, his voice rough with honesty. "I thought my life ended out here, when I buried my wife, when I stopped believing the land could give me anything but pain. But then you came, and I reckon God wasn't done writing my story after all." Ioka's eyes softened, her lips curving in the rarest of smiles. "Nor mine." The wind swept across the plains, carrying with it the scent of rain. Together they stood on the porch, hands clasped, watching the horizon darken into night. And within the walls of that weathered cabin, a light burned, not only from the fire, but from two souls who had chosen to carry each other's burdens, to believe in truth, and to make a home from the ashes a loss. My friends, stories like Daniel and Ioka's are not only about the past. They remind us of the burdens we all carry, the wounds we all bind, and the grace we find when someone chooses to walk beside us. Perhaps you, too, have known the ache of loneliness, or the quiet strength it takes to keep moving forward when the trail grows steep.
These are not just tales of gunpowder and dust. They are true Wild West stories of love, redemption, and the courage to build a home out of loss. If this journey stirred your heart, let it remind you that hope is never gone, and faith still lights the darkest road. I would be honored if you stayed with me for the next tale. Subscribe to the channel, share your thoughts below, and together we'll keep these fires burning, one story, one memory, one evening at a time.